Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, we talk about a very difficult subject, the war in Ukraine. And I sit down with Evan Hunter, Executive Vice President of Scholar Leaders, to talk about the state of the church and theological education in Ukraine. What's happening in biblical and theological education in a time of war? Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, President of the Association for Biblical Higher Education. This episode is going to be a little bit different in that the subject matter is kind of heavy. We're going to be talking about Ukraine and the conflict that's happening there within the context of biblical and theological education, as well as the church. So if you're a regular listener to our show, you know that we typically don't delve into political issues, and we won't in this one. That's not the purpose of it. It really is to discuss how war impacts a country, specifically when it comes to things like theological education and the church. So the person that I felt would be best to talk about this is somebody who's actually been in Ukraine on several occasions on the ground during the war. That person is Evan Hunter. I got to know Evan through both of us serving on ICET, which is the International Council for Evangelical Theological Education. I think I got that right, Evan?
Yeah.
Yeah, we both serve on that board together. Recently, we were in Albania at C25, which is an ICET event, and we had a couple conversations about this and thought that it would be great to bring him on to talk about Ukraine. Evan is the Executive Vice President of Scholar Leaders, and Scholar Leaders is an organization that equips theological leaders globally through scholarships, leadership training for those who are in the majority world. So, Evan, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You have been on the ground in Ukraine. Give us a broad sense of what it's like. Headlines, our feeds are just full of images, little snippets, 10-second snippets, and then we move on with life. You have actually been in Ukraine during the war. Talk to us what it's like.
The day the war started in February of 2022, I was actually in the country of Moldova with a Ukrainian colleague. We had planned 2 weeks of engagements with seminaries from Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Kyrgyzstan, working sequentially with each one on issues of strategy and some of the work that we do with seminary leaders. We had just concluded 2 days of work with one of the seminaries from Russia, and we're waiting the arrival of leaders from Ukrainian school who messaged to inform us they weren't going to come because of the buildup on the border. It became evident that that was intensifying quickly. And on the morning of February 24th, my colleague Taras, who's Ukrainian, said it has begun, and tanks and missiles had crossed those borders. I was there on the ground, very close to it as it began, and in fact, had to figure out how to get out of the country of Moldova because airspace was shut down, and there was pretty intense uncertainty. Subsequently, I've been back in Ukraine 8 times thus far, with another trip or 2 planned here in 2025.
So just curious, I'll interrupt you there. What's it like? How do you get into the country when a country is in war?
Yeah, the airports are shut down. So to enter Ukraine, we do so across a land border. Most often that has been traveling in through Warsaw, Poland, have gone in and out through Moldova, and once through Hungary. So it has all depended on things that are happening within the nation during that time. People first ask always, is it dangerous? And obviously it's not safe. It's a country at war, and every night almost there are attacks between drones and missiles on civilian infrastructures. So it's not as if it's isolated in one particular war front or strategic location. But I often tell people it's not safe, but I haven't felt in imminent danger. Every time I've been there, I've heard air raid sirens at night multiple times, sometimes during the day, have had missile strikes within a couple miles of where I've been. So it's scary in that regard. But it's a reality many of our sisters and brothers are living with daily, and watching the toll that takes of where it becomes part of your daily routine, and hearing the sirens and watching the attacks and seeing the reports is very sobering and challenging. And to be with people still matters.
Yeah. It's hard to picture, like, does life, I mean, in some respects, life goes on, right? You need to go to the grocery store, you need to go to work, you need to go to church. There's normal functions of life, and yet there's war happening.
Absolutely. And it's one of the strange juxtapositions. And you can imagine over the 3+ years of the war, there have been ebbs and flows of the intensity of the normalcy being very much there. You go to the grocery store and buy things. People are out on the streets doing some things. At times, that has been very limited. I was there the first winter of the war when attacks on infrastructure were quite intense. Those attacks rendered most of the country with very little power. And that was an eerie time because, especially after dark, you would see an isolated light here and there of people who had generators, or stores that would have a generator chained to the outside of their building to keep the lights on for a few hours. And when the power would come on, people would come out to take care of things and then retreat back to their homes. Subsequent trips have not been as bad in that regard. But yeah, life does go on. There are several things that stand out. One is, especially early in the war, with so many people being displaced, when you were in cities like Kyiv, you saw very few children. When you moved into the West, say in Lviv, where many of the internally displaced people were fleeing to, you would see lots of women and children. Subsequently, right now, it depends where you are in the country as well. Cities that are very close to the front have obviously fewer people, but they have very few women, very few children. Most recent estimates are there's 6.5 million Ukrainians who have been displaced outside of the country, and several million more internally, well over a quarter of the population.
So where have they gone out, those who have been displaced out of the country?
Yeah, the vast majority are still in Europe in various places. Many exited through Poland, Hungary, migrated to places further west. Some have settled in various locations. Others have left and some returned. The migration and the forced displacement because of the war are one of the huge challenges that face Ukraine currently. You can imagine many families separated with women, children, particularly families who have teenage males not wanting them in the country for fear of conscription and those things. But separated families are a significant issue, and the longer that goes on, the bigger those issues become for even what does it look like to reunify families. And whenever and however this war ends, the toll on families will be immense. And the reintegration of people, whether in Ukraine or in other locations, as people who've had to remain leave, things will be far from settled whenever the war is done. And it will probably be generational impact. And that's just a sober reality of that. But yeah, on the ground, there are moments that seem very normal. We've had a number of gatherings and training events, and some of those have felt very much like they did pre-war. And then a moment when the sirens go off, or a moment when the alerts go off. And at this point, every single Ukrainian has somebody close to them who has died in the war.
I was just going to ask that.
Reality.
Yeah, with the number of casualties, I can't imagine that there's not a person in Ukraine who hasn't lost a family member or a loved one or a neighbor, which compounds the reality of the juxtaposition of moments of normalcy versus all of a sudden you're thrown into the reality of, oh, wait a second, there's a war going on here.
Absolutely. And my good friend and colleague, Taras Dyatlik, his brother was serving as a medic in the Ukrainian military in some very difficult places on the front lines. He was killed in a drone attack on his ambulance on July 6th of 2024. Happened to be the same day their sister gave birth to her first child. So you can imagine when you talk about juxtaposition of realities. In November, we were together in his hometown of Rivne and went to the cemetery where Andrei is buried. And that cemetery has graves that have moved beyond the boundaries of the local cemetery. And it struck me as you saw these rows and rows of graves, each with Ukrainian flags. These are all military or killed during the war, some civilians, but all killed during the war. And seeing the rows and the dozens and dozens of people from this one mid-sized town that had been killed, and it's one of 3 or 4 cemeteries in the town, and realizing I knew the date when Andre was killed, which meant every grave past his was a death that happened since his death. A different way of realizing the progress of the war, the continuation of that. And people carrying those wounds, pastors who have literally been doing funerals at rates that are unheard of during times of peace. And the toll that takes on a pastor to do multiple funerals in a week after week after week. And the challenges that come with that for the church of how does one even open up the scriptures and try to comfort one more family, one more time, and do that with such frequency is a toll that those of us who've served in ministry can't even imagine of the weight that comes with that.
Yeah. It's almost like there are elements of it that you can't even unpack yet. And humans are resilient. It's amazing when you look historically, and some of it is captured in our conversation here about humans by nature look for homeostasis. So whatever the conditions are, they adjust, and that becomes their new normal. And it's so hard to picture and imagine all of the tragedy and a human being having to understand that as the new normal, right? A new bar is set, and that is now considered what normalcy is. And I'm constantly challenged with just the blessings that we have. Do we have issues in our country? For sure we do, but it's to a totally different level when you're talking about life and death, and the impact that the war has had on so many different people. And you being there so many times and experiencing it, I think what you're doing is fantastic. And what ScholarLeaders is doing is you're not pausing and waiting for the war to be over to then re-engage as if everything was normal. We know from history that this is a generational impact, and all that we've talked about, like, it's almost too soon to even talk about what those impacts are going to be because there's a war going on. And in some respects, it has to end before we fully understand the massive toll that this has played on an entire country.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is part of that challenge of how do you keep moving forward in the moment, thinking about what may come next. But after more than 3 years, this is a state of normal that no one would wish for, but that people continue to live through and find ways to do that.
So let's talk about that, because part of that normalcy is, in Ukraine, there are Bible colleges, there are seminaries, there are universities, and there are churches, right? So yes. Theological education serves the church. So let's start with the church specifically. You mentioned the pastors and what their new normal looks like. What's the state of the evangelical Christian church in Ukraine?
Well, as my good friend Taras says about almost everything related to Ukraine these days, it's complicated. It's not a simple answer. But I think we see two things. One, we see a church that has suffered immense loss in addition to members, both the migration of people away, including estimates are that the evangelical churches have lost hundreds and hundreds of pastors, whether to migration, whether to fighting in the war, volunteering as chaplains. But there are hundreds and hundreds of pastoral positions that have been vacated. And that's a big toll. And there are thousands and thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians who have been forced to move as either internal or external refugees. So that takes a significant toll. At the same time, we've seen continued growth of the church. I have been in multiple churches. I preached in a couple of churches at requests from friends, and I feel like, what do I have to say? And they said, first of all, you can just give me a break.
Wow.
By coming in preaching.
Yeah.
But of churches where, the one where the pastor said, look, this church has been replanted 3 times. We started this church and COVID happened. We restarted the church and it grew again and the war happened and almost all those families left. And now we've restarted and now here it is again. Well over 80% of the families were new to that church since the start of the war. Same thing at a church in the city of Bucha, where you may recall a number of the high-profile atrocities were committed in the early days of the war, mass graves and just truly genocidal type killing happening. The Baptist church there, which is this decent-sized church, lost so many members as people fled and moved away, and it is full on every Sunday. People are looking for meaning and hope, and the church has a significant role to play in that process. And the church, the evangelical church, has stepped up in humanitarian care. In the early days of the war, the church was one of the lifelines that was providing support, food, shelter. The seminaries themselves organized in a way that I've never seen among the evangelical church in other places, a degree of cooperation and networking and helping move people across the country, hosting them on their campuses, providing meals on a daily basis, providing opportunities for people to get new clothes or to wash their clothes as they move on, providing medication, providing spiritual care and help and scriptures. And for many of these coming out of places in which the evangelical church, while Ukraine has the highest evangelical presence of anywhere in the Eastern European region, it's still a small percentage of the overall population. Yes, Ukraine has been the sort of Bible Belt of Eastern Europe, so to speak, which plays into other challenges among the rhetoric of the war. But for many, this was first encounters with evangelicals in a meaningful way. And to see that kind of care, that kind of Matthew 25 care for people happening has absolutely led to people drawing closer to God. And so on the one hand, there's been immense loss. On the other hand, there has been growth, and God is at work in the midst of the suffering. God is at work in the midst of the pain and the uncertainty. And people are searching for hope and meaning. And as the church, we can at least point to the one who has the answer for that. And even as many of the Christians are struggling with both of those, of where is hope, what is meaning in the midst of such atrocity, and yet still clinging to Christ. And I think that's been one of the testimonies of the church.
Yeah, it is. And that's, we know it from our own personal lives with the difficulties that we face, that it's the common question, how can God let something like this happen? And that's the wrong question. We know why. It's because of sin, and sin has infiltrated every aspect of our being, of our lives. And that's where faith comes in, to know that that we have a trust. We do have a hope. As bleak as it gets, there is still the eternal hope that comes because of Jesus Christ. And those just aren't words. And they're being forced to actually live it out, living their faith out. And it's not the Sunday school answer to, well, you have Jesus, so you have hope. They're actually, there's truth. There is truth to that Sunday school answer, and they actually are living it out in their everyday lives in the church context. So switch over to now theological education. So like I said, there are Bible colleges, there are seminaries. Have they suspended classes? Are they meeting? Are they training? If pastors have left, are they now training a new generation of pastors? What's kind of been going on there?
Most of the schools, and particularly the schools in our orbit, are still functioning. For many, there was a time in the immediately following the full-scale invasion, in which a lot of operations were suspended, as I said, because they were doing a lot of humanitarian care and involved. We were part of organizing a group of a dozen seminaries that were networking together. And we along with Mesa Global, a sister organization, were helping to raise some funds and bring them in. And the way that they would distribute those based on need, it wasn't about making sure everybody got their equal share. It was who has the most need, making sure resources were there for each of their needs. Seminaries in the East providing vans to evacuate people, especially elderly or those who had various physical handicaps and couldn't just go on their own, providing meals. Those in the West providing shelter and housing people as they traveled, and a whole host of things in between. It was in August of 2024, so about 6 months after the war started, was the first time I went back into the country, and we convened a group of seminary leaders. And the language they used was returning to our first calling.
Interesting.
And that was to get back to providing theological education and training for pastors and missionaries and Christian workers. But it was going to look different. It was going to look different for several reasons. One of our seminary partners in the city of Kherson, Trevisky Christian Institute, their entire campus was destroyed. The Russian army invaded and occupied it. The Ukrainians pushed them out. The Russians came back in and then got pushed back out. So you can imagine of the course of that. Nothing, there is not a single building that is usable. Everything has been damaged beyond repair and usability. And to use them as a case study of an extreme, but others in degrees of this, they relocated all of their faculty and staff, or most of them, to the far west and Transcarpathia region of Ukraine, started providing classes online, continuing to serve students, continuing to have new students sign up. And they have recently now secured a new building in the city of Kyiv, the capital city, and are moving there, have just relocated there and will be opening a lot of that new building this fall. So resilience continuing on. And across the board, you see this. Combinations of residential and online learning are happening just like they were before, but perhaps more online. What we are seeing are more shorter courses, programs in counseling, chaplaincy, needing to fill these pastoral positions. There are young or new leaders, not always young, but new leaders stepping into roles of trying to shepherd the flock, but doing so obviously in an immense degree of intensity, and how to equip them and providing perhaps course by course training as much as full degree training. Full degrees are still happening, but you're seeing a lot of people enroll in courses based on very immediate needs. And chaplaincy obviously increased considerably. Many of the pastors looking to be volunteer chaplains with the military, which is a significant thing in Ukraine. Ukrainian Christianity has had a long tradition of pacifism. And one can imagine particularly under the Soviet era, but even before that, the state, the Tsarist rulers, as well as the Soviet rulers, and then there's ecclesiology in the Orthodox Church, the evangelical church was always an oppressed minority. So the government was always your enemy, not your protector. In this war, a sense of patriotism and identity has emerged that has not been a part of the church in its history, and therefore wrestling with, is there a right way to engage war if you come from a highly pacifist tradition? Is it being a defensive war different than being an aggressive war? Significant questions. And Christians who are fighting, wrestling with this because it cuts against their historical understanding. It's a new theological framing for that.
And I'd imagine too, this isn't the only part of the world where there's conflict and war. There are other places and they're having similar kinds of conversations, and it's challenging worldviews. It's challenging theological frameworks, because those who they were in partnership, membership with, relationship with, in theological education in Russia is now being, is broken and challenged. Well, what happens then relationally? And I think that's some of what still needs to be unpacked. It's almost like it's too soon to do that. And we have to be very careful to not gloss over that, well, just because you're brothers and sisters in Christ, that means that we all, sing Kumbaya and we get along with each other, that you can't ignore the fact that this human rift has happened.
Absolutely. And those are some both deep wounds, but relationally, and then they bring all sorts of questions of ecclesiology and who is the church and what does it mean for us to be brothers and sisters of the body of Christ? And how do we relate to each other? And how do you relate to those outside of your situation? A lot of wrestling with that, and where are the places for being reconciled with one another? Also, where are the places for, in the middle of intense hurt, where's the space for the lament that's a part of that process as well? And that's been a theme that many of the theological leaders have pointed to, that there's a deep sense of lament in the midst of loss, of atrocity, of deep, deep wounding that's a part of that. And you can't rush into superficial reconciliations.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
at times it feels like the Christian church wants that.
Yeah. So let's actually end on that piece of it. I want to make sure that we give enough time to this because I'm a fixer, right? I just want to get in and I just want everybody to be okay and to live in love with each other and then move on. Even though there's good intention for people like me who are fixers and want to fix a situation, what are we doing that's, even though our intentions are good, what are we doing that actually makes it worse? And what should we be doing to make it better?
I was recently asked to speak at a chapel service in relation to things happening in Ukraine. And I drew on two passages that largely mirror one another from 1 Corinthians 12 and from Romans 12. And the one stating that if one part of the body suffers with it. And the second being that we are called as the body of Christ to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. But I think when we look at our sisters and brothers in Ukraine, taking very seriously, what does it mean to weep with those who weep? And during their time of weeping, to not jump to that fixing, because it's our nature for many of us, both by personality, certainly by culture of the United States. We're a people of doing, and historically with very little of the kind of weeping that's happening in this moment. And in that, several things strike me. One is, as we weep, to listen well. Several of the Ukrainian theologians, theological leaders right now are talking about, the kind of theological questions and work they're doing, they find very important. And one of the things they talk about is peacetime theologies come up short in times of intense crisis. We mentioned sort of the pat answers ring hollow. And a lot of those are developed in peacetime. The history of the church has been marked by conflict more than peace. And much of our theology has come in times of crisis. So rather than thinking we might have the theological answers and the fixing, maybe to spend a little bit more time weeping and listening. And if we look at the book of Job, we find that his friends who came and were quick to offer all kinds of answers didn't really have the depth of things. And at the end of the entire account of Job, Job's the one who comes away with the much, much deeper understanding of God. And there's probably a lesson for us there of not being too quick to speak and to fix, but to sit and to listen. And boy, that's hard for us. It's hard for me. And yet there's something highly incarnational about being present with people during their time of suffering, of seeking to understand. And there are opportunities that we can do things because we're not experiencing the hurt as directly, and we can hold some things for people and with people that they can't hold in the time of that immense pain. So there's a role there too, but we want to make sure we move slowly into it.
Yeah.
So that we take seriously what's happening with these siblings in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. There are multiple ways, scholar leaders who you represent, and that's when you go, that's who you're representing and working with. Are there giving opportunities from a financial perspective? Are there financial needs that can help too?
There are. I mean, both scholar leaders and our colleague organization, Mesa Global, have been continuing to do some of the humanitarian work. That need has not gone away, and it intensifies in times of increased attack and damage. So that has been one of the things people have given toward. Obviously, the continued work of trying to help equip these seminaries for a task that is evolving and changing. I often remark at the resilience of Ukraine. To watch new buildings continue to be built during the middle of a war in the cities, to watch seminaries continue to plan for the future. And part of it is, as we said at the beginning, you can't just sit and wait for this all to end. And it strikes me when people say, why would you even do that in the middle of the war? I think when we look at our mission and our calling and encourage people to think about this and perhaps, visit our website, visit Mesa Global's website, you can see opportunities there, is one, the church is going to be present in whatever the aftermath of the war will be. Whether that's a victorious peace for Ukraine, whether that's a very oppressive, suffering peace for Ukraine, or lack of peace, but halt of the actual hostility. But the church is going to be there. And the church is going to also be seeking leadership and guidance from the theological schools, because that's one of the roles we play of equipping leaders and providing some orientation to these big questions that are happening. And those are going to intensify, not diminish. And so why invest in the church and why invest in even theological education during a war? Because those are some of the things that will continue to remain. And if anything, the needs will increase, not decrease over the course of time. And we have courageous leaders, and they bristle sometimes at the idea of being courageous. So maybe we have faithful leaders who continue to move forward in the midst of the pain and the atrocity. And as an organization and personally as a friend, I want to do all I can to stand with them during this time of immense pain and challenge and hurt. And yet, with these moments and places of hope that are being clung to. And as I said, and God at work in ways continuing to draw women and men to himself, continuing to transform lives, even in the midst of unspeakable atrocity. And that's part of the hope of the gospel and the power of the gospel. And the church will continue to shine that light, even in immense darkness. And regardless of outcome, we want to be there and be equipped for what may come in the future.
Evan, you're the embodiment of how we need to respond. We're not in it. We are distant from it. And yet we're called to respond. And there are multiple ways for us to do that. So thank you for helping us unpack a very difficult situation. It makes the political elements just not even important in the grander scheme of what our role is as Christ followers. And you've done such a great job of walking us through that. And my prayer, I know it's your prayer, is that folks that listen to this will know how to respond. And part of responding is praying. Part of responding is weeping with those who are in difficult situations. Part of that response is giving financially to help with the initiatives that are going on. And I think together we can see the kingdom of God impacted through our hands. After all, that's what God has called us to do. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And I'll be sure in the show description, we will put in some links to Mesa Global as well as ScholarLeaders so that if God is laying it on your heart to respond to what we talked about, there are definitely opportunities for you to respond in financial ways, but also other resource ways. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.